put out by the Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy. It also marks the launch of Navi Books, Vidhi's open access digital book publishing platform. And I'm delighted that all of you could be here today to join in this occasion with us. At Vidhi, our mission has always been to write better laws for India. And part of this mission requires us to take a very long-term view of change. And we know that change can only happen if people understand issues in a nuanced manner and in an informed way. And that's really the purpose of Navi Books, to ensure that we have an informed citizenry. So the first book that we are putting out today is Hamīñ Ast. As the title itself suggests, it's a book on Jammu and Kashmir. It's a biography of Article 370 as to how Jammu and Kashmir became a part of the Union of India and took on what is now known as special status, how that special status was eroded by successive governments over a period of 70 years, only to be abruptly brought to an end 3 years ago on this day, 5th of August 2019. Our second book, which will be released in a few months' time, later this year, is called Holding Our Heads High, which is about the controversial office of the governor. How can this colonial institution be made to work in non-colonial times in 21st century India? So at Navi, we want to publish books on issues that are complex, legal, political, but we want to do it for a general reader, that is you. And the idea behind it is that how can we take these subjects and make it simple? So this is written by experts, reviewed by peers, but written for a general readership. All you need is an internet connection and perhaps a change of mindset. I really love my paper book, but I think a digital book is certainly worth a try, at least once in a while. I hope you'll enjoy the reading experience in Navi. But as you can also equally understand that the issues that we focus on are not issues that are going to be solved very easily. These are issues that are fairly intractable. We're not going to, unfortunately, have a solution to the problem in Jammu and Kashmir very quickly. We're neither going to have a solution to the problem in relation to governance very quickly. But we know that these are discussions that we need to have. And where reason and rationality can't enter, perhaps music can. So I'm most delighted today to welcome Saptarshi Mondal on the sitar, Manoj Kumar Sharma on the santoor, accompanied by Vijay Vishwakarma on the tabla. Thank you very much for gracing this occasion with your presence. And it is particularly apt that in a book on Article 370 and Jammu and Kashmir, we start with Santoor-Sitar Jugalbandi. It's perhaps a slice of harmony that has been very elusive in that state. But hopefully, one day, that slice of harmony will become a little more real. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming here today. To all participants who have joined on Zoom, thank you very much for joining. And now I'll hand it over to the performers for the evening. Thank you.
अभी 20 मिनट चलेगा ना सिंगल, अभी तो जूम ऑन करने की जरूरत नहीं है।
Pass it. Put it back. I will read.
कंटिन्यू पूरा कंटिन्यू इस कॉर्नर पे पूरा कंटिन्यू सिर्फ कंटिन्यू कंटिन्यू He told me 7 o'clock.
Thank you so much. I think that was a riveting performance, and I certainly don't think me or Otto or any of us could have asked for a better launch to the book and to Navi Portal. Thank you all. We have a small token of appreciation. If Shreya, you could come up on stage. Yeah. Can we also have another round of applause for them, please? Sure, there's just flowers right there. Thank you so much once again. This is just good evening all. Firstly, I think on behalf of all of the four co-authors, Argo, Kevin, Pranay, and me, I'd like to thank everyone for being here today for this launch. And Hamīñ Ast has been a 3-year-long endeavor for all of us. And as Argo mentioned, Hamīñ Ast traces the constitutional and legal history of Article 370 from its origins as a placeholder that guaranteed the state of Jammu and Kashmir some say in the constitutional arrangement with India until its sudden abrogation in 2019. And needless to say, much has been said and written on Kashmir. The existing literature on the state covers aspects of its ethnography, history, politics, the dispute at the UN, the war with Pakistan, militancy, and the existing human rights situation in Kashmir. So there is a lot of literature on Kashmir in general. However, when it comes to Article 370, which is the constitutional link that bound the state to India, there is very little that's actually written. There is some academic documentation, but very, very little for the non-academic audience. And we were hoping that Hamīñ Ast would fill this void by being a book to the general reader and by simplifying Article 370 and its history for the general reader. And the book, by analyzing archival documents, including archival documents that have not been identified before, as well as historical literature, makes a couple of arguments. I won't be giving away too much of the book, but I'll briefly state a couple of arguments. Firstly, the book argues that Article 370 was devised as a temporary placeholder, which provided no real substantive safeguards with respect to special status for Jammu and Kashmir. It only provided a procedural safeguard. There was no substantive safeguard for Jammu and Kashmir. And secondly, it shows that, the book argues that in the midst of growing distrust between Jammu and Kashmir and India, or rather the political players between, the two primary political players in Jammu and Kashmir and India, new political alliances were formed as a result of that distrust. And because new political alliances were formed, Article 370 ended up becoming a mainstay of the Indian Constitution, from a temporary placeholder to a mainstay of the Indian Constitution when the Jammu and Kashmir Constituent Assembly dissolved without making any recommendation under Article 370 to the President of India. And this mainstay then led to more and more integration of the state with India. That's what the book argues. And thereafter, the final chapters of the book analyze the legal tenability of the abrogation. So that's the book. I won't be saying much as of now. I hope you enjoy reading the book as much as we had fun writing it for 3 years. I think now I'd like to introduce our panelists today for the panel discussion. And if I can call Mr. Wajahat Habibullah on the stage, former Chief Information Commissioner, Government of India, and he's also written quite extensively on Kashmir. Welcome, sir.
मैं देख लूँगा ना किसी कैमरा रख लीजिए यहाँ पे लैपटॉप पर.
Arghya Sengupta, Research Director with the Center for Legal Policy, who is the moderator for the panel discussion today. And joining us on Zoom today, we have Dr. Mridu Rai, Professor and Historian, Presidency College. She's also the author of the book, Hindu Rulers, Muslim Subjects. One of the first few books that we actually read before we started working on this book. So
just continue.
Good evening, Professor Mridu Rai. So nice to have you, and so nice to see you again.
Likewise, pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Audio output to nahi.
Yeah.
Can you just check?
And Senior Advocate Mr. Arvind Datar is also joining us via Zoom. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm sorry I couldn't be present physically.
And I think, Keshav, perhaps we can go to the portal and launch the portal and the book before we start the panel discussion. So this is Navi Portal, and the first book on Navi Portal, as you can see, the cover is Hamīñ Ast, the Biography of Article 370, and it also has a lot of other multimedia around the book. It has an audio book, it has a podcast, it also has blogs. So that's Hamīñ Ast. The portal is now live. You can actually go on the portal and download the book and read it, and also check out the other multimedia, as well as the second book, which is coming by Navi, which is Heads Held High on Governance for 21st Century of India. So that's the second book coming up, but Hamīñ Ast is now live and it's on the portal for everyone to read. I hope you guys enjoy it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Janali. You see that there are these two QR code scanners here. You can use that to directly go and access the book. It's a different kind of experience to you scan a QR code on your mobile and read a book. But I think what we've tried to do with Hamīñ Ast is to make sure that it is an easy book to read, something that you can read very simply on your phone. And we look forward to all the feedback that you give us in terms of how to make it an easier reading experience for everybody. But I hope on behalf of everyone at Vidhi, there's a huge team that has put this together, that you enjoy reading our book and the Navi Books portal. Without any further ado, let me quickly get to the panel discussion. We've got a really eminent set of speakers here. Wajahat Habibullah is here. Mr. Arvind Datar joined us from Chennai, and Mridu Rai joined us from Calcutta. So Mridu, if I could start with you. You've written what is perhaps the most definitive account of Jammu and Kashmir during the Dogra period. And your book, Hindu Rulers, Muslim Subjects, talks about how Gulab Singh, the founder of the Dogra dynasty, got the state of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh and Gilgit-Baltistan from the British in the famous of Amritsar. The Treaty of Amritsar, of course, was later called, quote unquote, a sale deed, and obviously led to much controversy. So I was wondering whether you could start by telling us a little bit about how the history of Kashmir, and I use Kashmir as a shorthand for that entire region, the history of Kashmir as a state with Hindu rulers and Muslim subjects played into the post-independent developments in Kashmir, particularly around its special status in India. Mridu?
Great. Can you hear me? I hope I'm audible. I think. Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. First of all, thank you so much for having me here this evening for the launch of what I think is a very important and an excellent book. I enjoyed reading it. It's lucid and enormously informative. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Yes, I do believe that the history, right, of Jammu and Kashmir is important today, at least for modern history. The 19th and early 20th century history of Kashmir is highly relevant today. I think it provides both a precedent and a model for many contemporary acts. Right, so Jammu and Kashmir's past and I'd say present are linked through several significant lines of quite remarkable continuity. I'd like to just briefly draw out only a few here. The Treaty of Amritsar of 1846 was, as you mentioned, a sale deed. At least it's been perceived as one, right? Now, whether Kashmiri's forcible incorporation into the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir that was brought into being through that treaty in March 1846 was radically more unfair than the experience of other peoples whose territories were similarly shoved into other states formed under the aegis of British colonialism is not the most important issue. I think the issue is how its Muslim majority subject population came to be marginalized by their Dogra rulers and the state they established, that is the Dogras established, over the centuries since 1846. It is that which produced the characterization of the treaty as a sale deed in the first half of the 20th century. Just as a very quick background, of course, the state came into being because of British colonial concerns for the internal stability of the strategically located state, right? And it opened up, this British concern opened up the possibilities for the Dogra rulers to draw their legitimacy to rule, not by culling this legitimacy from the majority population of their subjects, but from several extraterritorial or indeed deterritorialized arenas, right? First, the protecting hand of the British imperial government against internal threats, that was vitally important. And secondly, of course, the Dogras claiming the status of natural and original Indian rulers by reference to their being Rajputs and Hindus in very generic terms. The result, I argued in my book, was that the legitimating devices installed by the Dogras and by their British overlords made Muslims, barring a very small, carefully selected segment of elites, peripheral to the power arrangements that were established within the state. The British guarantee of Dogra sovereignty vis-a-vis his subjects basically staved the need for the ruler to seek legitimacy from, by going through the older practice of granting patronage to all of his diverse subject population, right? So freed from the obligations of making themselves, quote unquote, representative rulers, the Dogras focused on establishing all of the ceremonial trappings of a specifically Hindu sovereignty. The legitimating references derived from outside the territorial boundaries of their fiefdom, but the sovereignty was enacted within the boundaries of the state. So one line of continuity.
I'm just going to quickly interrupt you there,
Yeah.
So that we can get some opening remarks from the others, because I think that's a very important segue that I can take to Mr. Habibullah, that
Yeah.
the sovereignty, the legitimating factor of Dogra rule obviously came from the British, and the fact that the British were their overlords. Now, you were in a very different context. You were in Jammu, you were a serving bureaucrat in Jammu and Kashmir, an IS officer of the Jammu and Kashmir cadre. You've written very evocatively about the subject in your book. And you were Commissioner at a very difficult time in Jammu and Kashmir during the time of separatism, where the really officers of the Indian Administrative Service were safe. There was a time of militancy. And how do you see this question of integration with India through Article 370, which was the vehicle for integration and the vehicle for Indian sovereignty in Jammu and Kashmir? And when you were there at that time as a young officer, did you think that this question of sovereignty was, as Mridu was trying to say, still there was a feeling that sovereignty was from outside and not from within?
And you see, this is, and I would congratulate Mridu on her work, of course, as you mentioned, it's a definitive work. What she has brought out is this Rajput state was specifically created in that area because on the one side you had a large Muslim population surrounding it, and on the south and the east was a Sikh population. At that time you had a very powerful Sikh empire, which, although was in alliance with the British, was looked upon as a threat by the British, and therefore they supplanted it with this. And Vijay has brought this out very beautifully in her book. So what the position is, and taking on from what Mridu has said, it was not quite so simple as simply Muslim and Dogra, nor even Muslim and Hindu. Among Muslims, there were different sections of Muslims. And this was very, very apparent to me when I was there. The majority of the Muslim population, in fact, the majority of the population of Jammu is Kashmiri. But Kashmiri is not necessarily Muslim. You have Kashmiri Pandits and Kashmiri Muslims. And the Kashmiri Muslims and the Muslims of the Jammu division are quite different because the languages are different, the culture is. And of course, it is also, but we won't go into that, it also said that why the line of control was called where the line of control actually was finally drawn was because Sheikh Abdullah was not very interested in the rest of Kashmir because that was not Kashmiri Muslim. It is also, and I know this, you know this, you have mentioned it in your work, but there were those terrible riots in Jammu, pre-partition, at the time of partition. There was not a squeak for Sheikh Abdullah. The person who objected very strongly was then the Prime Minister of India, who was Jawaharlal Nehru. So the problem here, what is developed here, and this is also characteristic, it's an interesting historical development. And I think Mridu will find it interesting also. Similar developments grew up. Now, in the national movement, the two greatest supporters, the two most important Muslim supporters of the national movement with the largest support base were Sheikh Abdullah and Khan Abdul Ghaffar. Here, they were seeking to build a nation on the sub-nationalism of their own nation. But in that case, Khan al-Farha was basically a Pathan. And Sheikh Abdullah was basically a Kashmir. And his stand was not so much against the colonial. Yes, the stand of Sheikh of Khan al-Farha was against the colonial rule, ruled directly by the British. But in this case, Jammu and Kashmir was not under British rule. So his stand was against the monarchy, against the Dogra. And here you've talked about Article 370 actually being having a delicate compromise. In fact, it was a delicate compromise because you had on the one side the traditional dynasty of Jammu and Kashmir, which was the one which is legally the one that had acceded to India. But the compulsion for that accession to India came from Sheikh Abdullah, who had resisted an incursion. Also, unlike the Northwest frontier, Jammu and Kashmir had been subjected to invasion. By whom? By fellow Muslims, tribals. And Pakistan specifically selected that as trust. The Muslims have to find a state for themselves. And India is not a Muslim state. So that became the festering storm between India and Pakistan.
That's right. And I think this is a very valid point that you're making, that this is not simply about Hindu versus Muslim. There's obviously much more at play when we are talking about Jammu and Kashmir. I take this to Mr. Datar. Mr. Datar, you're of course one of the leading authorities on Indian federalism. And Article 370 is traditionally seen by constitutional law scholars as an example of asymmetric federalism. That is a state which has a different relationship with the union than most other states. And that has been a precedent for several other states, particularly northeastern states, which have their own arrangements with the union. A lot of these arrangements are conditions of accession, like Nagaland, and also in the case of Jammu and Kashmir. So when Article 370 gets nullified on the 5th and 6th of August 2019, how do you see that nullification from the perspective of Indian federalism as is embodied in the Constitution?
First, good evening to all of you. And Argo, let me first congratulate you and the three of you, the four of you, for bringing out such a wonderful book. I think in just about 100 pages, you have summarized everything that has to be said. And it was quite a learning experience for me as well when I went through all those 6 chapters. Now, coming to your question, if you see the history of, you yourself have in your book mentioned how 370 came to be drafted. It was 306 of the draft, and it became 370, the role of Gopalaswamy Iyengar, and so on and so forth. But if you see over the years, you say it's asymmetric federalism. But if you see the series of around 47, 49 orders which were passed from time to time, the asymmetry was substantially removed. And most of the provisions of the Constitution became applicable to it. As you know, except entry 97 and list 1, all the powers, Parliament could make any law with regard to entry 1 to 96. And the state had powers of entry 97, residuary powers, and also other powers. But by and large, most of the laws of India could be made applicable to Jammu and Kashmir. So that asymmetrism was substantially removed over the years. And the unique status, so to speak, if you make an honest appraisal, in the light of a series of Supreme Court judgments, starting with Premnath Kaul and ending with the State Bank of India judgment of Justice Nariman, they almost said that now Jammu and Kashmir is an integral part of India. It is it's part of the federal structure itself. The Constituent Assembly of Jammu and Kashmir was dissolved. They said we are a part of India. So I don't see how the deletion of the amendments to Article 370 by those 2 orders of 272 and 273 of 5th August and 6th August really brought about such a cataclysmic change. So I think that the demise of 370 was inevitable, but in fact, most of the special status had completely gone if you see the series of orders from time to time. And both 367 and 368 articles were also amended earlier by constitutional orders in 1965, and which have been upheld in that Damnu's case, Mohammad Maqbool Damnu's case. Yes.
So that's a very interesting perspective. It actually reminds me of something that Jawaharlal Nehru was supposed to have said when he was asked as to why this special status, and this is attributed to him, that he had said that ye ghiste ghis jayega, and that over a period of time this will erode. And again, there are some doubts about whether he actually said this or not, but certainly that is a sentiment, that special status was given as a kind of placeholder and it would go away at some point of time. But Jinali, if I could turn to you, one of the reasons that it didn't go away was because there was the agreement between Jawaharlal Nehru and Sheikh Abdullah in 1952, known as the Delhi Agreement, which was working out a detailed substantive compromise on what powers the Union government would have vis-a-vis the states, vis-a-vis the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And it seemed like it had all worked out. But in a chapter that you are the primary author of in the book, as you talk about how that agreement, the relationship between Nehru and Abdullah went south, the Delhi Agreement didn't go anywhere, and 370 became, the placeholder became permanent. So perhaps you'd like to tell us a little bit about that critical period in the history of 370, where it may have gone, but actually not only did it remain, but became permanent.
So, thank you for the question, Orvo. I think 1952, what is important to remember about the Delhi Agreement was that it was a political agreement, and the agreement, was just that. It was a set of 8 things that India and Kashmir at that point of time had agreed. And none of it would be really of any significance until and unless there was a presidential order that was passed under 370 reflecting those agreements. So until a presidential order was passed, the agreement was just a political agreement. And there was, in fact, a presidential order that was passed after the Delhi Agreement, but that only dealt with one part of the Delhi Agreement, which was the end of the hereditary rule of the Maharaja and the introduction of a Sadr Riyasat, which was going to be an elected governor or elected head of the state. Now, the reason the relationship between Nehru and Abdullah goes down south is because, and we speak about it in the initial chapters of the book, is that there's this constant tussle between the Maharaja and Abdullah. They were constantly at loggerheads. And, Abdullah really wanted to, get rid of the Maharaja. And they never really got along. So post the Delhi Agreement is actually finalized between 2 sides. The first thing that Abdullah does is that he says, let's have a presidential order and let's also amend 370 to remove the concept of a Maharaja and have an elected head of the state. And he goes ahead with that, despite Nehru saying that let's not do multiple notifications under 370. Rajendra Prasad saying let's not do multiple notifications. He says, no, let's get rid of the head of the, let's get rid of the Maharaja and get a Sadr Riyasat. And that sort of then becomes a trigger point for the Praja Parishad movement, which is the period that I cover on, because the Maharaja at that point of time was a cementing force in the state between the Hindus and the Muslims. It was a primarily Muslim state with a Hindu Maharaja, and he was the cementing force. With the Maharaja out of the picture now, there were these parties, the Bharatiya Janata Sangh, the Hindu Mahasabha, the Praja Parishad specifically, which is a regional Jammu party, which hits the street, and it's a 6-month-long agitation that they do after the removal of the Maharaja. And that sort of gives Abdullah the cold feet, and Nehru's also irritated with Abdullah. And it eventually leads to Abdullah having second thoughts about integrating with India. And he has these ideas where he wants to declare independence for Kashmir, and eventually that leads to his arrest. So the Delhi Agreement is important, yes, but it's important, because there was only a piecemeal implementation of the Delhi Agreement that happened. Had Abdullah gone ahead and actually implemented all of the Delhi Agreement, I think things would have turned out quite differently for both Nehru and Abdullah.
So I think that with these opening remarks, I think there are 3 themes that I'd like to explore, and I can see on Zoom that we have several participants who have questions, and we will have time for questions both from Zoom and from the audience here. So please keep your questions ready. But the first is this question of Article 370 as a symbol, before we come to the legality of the Article 370 as a constitutional question. So Mr. Habibullah, again, I turn to the fact that you were there, and Mridu, I'm going to come to you after this, that for you, was Article 370 merely a provision of the Constitution, which, as Mr. Datar said, had been eroded very significantly? And there were 93 out of those 97 entries apply, 260 constitutional provisions apply. It seems like it largely applied. There was a symbol of Article 35A and the permanent resident notification by which only permanent residents of Jammu and Kashmir could purchase land in Jammu and Kashmir and also get enrolled in have some special benefits for services in Jammu and Kashmir. But for you, as it was Article 370, a symbol that was worth persisting with or not?
Which administrative, and I was in the intelligence service, Article 370 was very irritating, not only for me, but people within the state also. I talked in terms of, say, the Right to Information Act. Now, the Right to Information Act had to go through a whole lot of convolutions before an act equivalent to the act which has already been passed in the rest of India by Parliament was actually imposed in J&K. It came up with Panchayat Raj Act even before the government of India had made constitutional amendments, but that was so regressive that it had to be again changed and modified thereafter, and of course now it's in conformity with the Constitution of India. So, and this is also true. I mean, and I say this, not only I as an administrator, sit and argue because I had a lot of interaction with people, and I would sit and argue. But your point is the symbol is the important point. It was considered, and also you know that the insurgency which broke out in 1990, of course, and it also now will be insurgent people. They all said that Article 370, which was supposed to give us a special status, it has not given us anything at all. And in fact, it has made us even worse off than other states in India. This was realized by the young people of Jammu. So not that they felt that now this act which is now gone, has taken away something that had been given. It was more symbolic. And I have been convinced, of course, that its nullification from an administrative point of view was not done properly. As you know, the Chief Secretary of JDK at the time that it was nullified was the person who has worked with me and is probably one of the most outstanding IAS officers in the country even today. But the manner in which it was done is without any consultation with the people and the democracy who are directly affected by that law. I'm sure that it will be debated. You would open debates in the universities, colleges, and things like that. You would have been able to find easy ways of getting over it, because in fact, in my view, there was no need for an Article 370. Once the state had acceded to India, then it was entitled to the benefits that all the other states and all the rest of India were actually entitled to. Article 370 denied it those benefits. The benefits, and I was told this by no less than Mirza Abdul after the Indira Shaikh Accord. He said, well, do we not want to have an election commission? Do we not want to have the Supreme Court of India? What is it that we don't want to have, that we need Article 370? Because you remember there was a commission set up after the Indira Shaikh Accord to see what had gone wrong with that, and the change was required to be made. So Article 370 was not really a factor which strengthened the sovereignty of the state. Symbolically, yes, because the state had a constitution of its own. But in actual fact, it was more regressive than the developments that were taking place in the rest of India, and those developments could not immediately apply to J&K because of Article.
That's right, and I think that's a very interesting perspective which complicates matters even further, because even when we draft statutes prior to 2019, we always said that this law shall apply to all states except the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And these were obviously laws that were intended for the benefit of the people of the state. So I'll take that to you, Mridu. Mr. Habibullah is making a very practical point that as a symbol it mattered, but it will also become an irritant, including for people who were separatists who were saying that this had actually denied the state benefits as other states had, because it was somehow considered special, but it was falling between two stools. What is your sense about Article 370 as symbol, vis-a-vis, and irritant?
There's one point that comes across so clearly from your book that I'd like to bring up for discussion, that in some ways, or in fact, sort of echoing what Mr. Datar also said, that in some ways it was hollowed out, but the way in which you describe, the constant overriding through presidential orders of Article 370 is also part of the legacy of Article 370, that in some ways, there was a push to have one client politician after another, right, after 1953 in the Valley. So in fact, I mean, the need to have sort of unrepresentative politicians in the Valley, one after the other, really comes from the gambit that they will acquiesce in every incursion, right, into the state's so-called autonomy. Point after point. So in terms of symbolically, perhaps, I think it's really, once it was unceremoniously repealed in 2019, that a lot of the discussion sort of around what 370 meant in the Valley sort of took off in completely different directions. I happened to be in the Valley in 2021, and there were mixed reviews. Some suggested that those who were out and out for independence suggested that 370 actually yoked them to India. So they saw no use for Article 370 anyway. Then there were those who said, well, at least it's repealing is, has taken the veil off the real intentions. But I think there's a very different sentiment towards Article 35A. And I think 35A was seen as a genuine protection for the people of Jammu, Ladakh, and Kashmir itself.
That's right. And I think just for everyone in the audience, as Article 35A allowed benefits to permanent residents of the state of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh. And there is now a very real demand to bring back Article 35A and its protections in some form to the state of Jammu and Kashmir, to the Union territory of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh. So, Mr. Datar, I think there is a fair amount of agreement here that Article 370 seemed to have become nobody's child. It had been hollowed out, and it was really devoid of substance, and even those who were not happy with integration with India didn't really see a point to Article 370 continuing. But the second point that I wanted to explore, which Mr. Habibullah touched on, was the manner of its nullification or abrogation in August of 2019. And Mr. Habibullah suggested that given the fact, and what we're hearing today is the fact that there was really no love lost for Article 370, or not as much as one would imagine, it perhaps would have been possible to do it differently. But let's look at it as a matter of law. As a question of law, Article 370 required that its own abrogation or nullification would require the Constituent Assembly of Jammu and Kashmir to agree that it should be abrogated. Now, the Constituent Assembly of Jammu and Kashmir had been wound up in 1957. There was no Constituent Assembly. So there was a device that was used, as you were mentioning, through Article 367, by which the Constituent Assembly was interpreted to mean the Legislative Assembly. Now, the Legislative Assembly was not functioning because of the fact that it was a state under President's rule. And because it was a state under President's rule, it was the Parliament which then said that, yes, you can go ahead and do it. So, in your view, was the manner of this nullification constitutionally sound, or does it offend the spirit of the article, which is really that it takes two hands to clap, that both people of Jammu and Kashmir, the democratically, the democratic sovereigns in that sense, and the people of India have to both agree, both hands have to clap before Article 370 can be abrogated, nullified, or changed.
Yeah, but before I come to both hands clapping, I would first like to point out the serious injustice that was caused by Article 35 capital A. I think Dr. Rai mentioned this, and there is a very detailed judgment of the Supreme Court which is almost forgotten today. This Bachanlal Kalgotra's judgment, where Justice Chinnappa Reddy points out, I mean, this is a very sad case of people who had migrated from West Pakistan into Kashmir, that stayed there for 4 decades, for 40 years they were staying in Kashmir, and they had absolutely no right. They had no right to property, no right to jobs. If you just see the litany of, the list of things that they could not possess, it's shocking that this could survive in a republican constitution like India, number one. Number two, this 35A and this concept of permanent residence, etc., led to a lot of injustice within the valley as per the Supreme Court judgment. And instead of doing some remedy about it, the Supreme Court at the end simply said the Union of India should look into it, Assembly should look into it and do justice to the people, which really was, the petitioners did not get any relief whatsoever. But this 35A, in fact, on a personal note, I was supposed to, we had agreed to challenge 35A in the Jammu and Kashmir High Court, but last minute the writ petition was not filed. And I had another doubt, which I had not really got time to develop it. How far would 35A survive after the basic structure came? If you say that Jammu is an integral part of India, all Kashmiris are citizens of India, then once you say that, then can you justify 35A and the difference? And will it not be anachronistic or paradoxical in part 3? But that's a different question altogether. But we often forget that what kind of injustice people had to suffer because of 35A within the state of Jammu and Kashmir, and that's been chronicled by the Supreme Court. Number one. Number two, well, there are views that was this the right way of doing it? Was it some kind of a constitutional sleight of hand or something like that? I don't see. There could be different means of achieving an end, and I don't see, frankly, any unconstitutionality in what they did. Because I'll tell you what, when you talk of two hands clapping, Article 370, Clause 3 says that you can't, this article will continue till to give the exact word of the 370. It says that this article will cease to be operative only with such exceptions. And then they say that the recommendation of the Constituent Assembly of the state will be necessary before the President issues a notification saying that the article will cease to operate. Now, the Constituent Assembly went off in 26 January 57, if I recollect the date correctly. So, out of the two hands clapping, one hand is not there at all. It's gone, right? Number two, now suppose you want to operate. Now, two views can be taken. You can say that once the Assembly goes, you can't make it inoperational. The other view can be that if the Assembly is not there anymore, Constituent Assembly of Jammu and Kashmir, then there is no question of getting their consent at all. The President can act without the proviso. It's another way of looking at it. So, from a strictly legal perspective, much has been criticized that they made the Constituent Assembly as a legislative assembly and within a day they abolished. I don't think, frankly, anything legally is wrong with that. I mean, it could be a matter of doing it something more in a different way. But to answer your question, I don't think anything is wrong in what they did once the Constituent Assembly ceased to exist.
Yeah. So, Mr. Habibullah, I'll take that to you in terms of the implications that this has on Indian federalism. Because one thing that worries me, and I agree with Mr. Datar on one point, that there could be two views on the constitutionality of the nullification of Article 370 in and of itself. It was a complex situation with the Constituent Assembly not existing, so something had to come in its place if it had to be done. But I think one of the key questions which has arisen as a consequence is that can the Union of India unilaterally now abolish another state somewhere else in the country? Because now this is, and make it a union territory. And I think that's the question which is sort of lingering in people's minds. Now, politically, that may or may not happen. That's a different issue. But there are many states which are at the margins, which have difficult arrangements. So, in your view, as a retired bureaucrat, how do you see this issue?
That's the conversation reached a very interesting point. There is where I see the sort of divergence between a legal point of view and an administrative point of view. The principle here is the Constituent Assembly, the Legislative Assembly, they are representative. They are not the people themselves. The principle here is that the people of the state of Jammu and Kashmir should be consulted through the representatives. But if they don't have representatives, elected representatives, then what is the alternative? Is the alternative by putting 3,000 of them into prison? Is that a way of consultation? When I say that it's a manageable done, mass arrests the entire political leadership for months in prison. That's a good way of doing these things. Particularly when I'm telling you, and I have been there throughout all those years of Article 370, up to 1977, when I was Deputy Commissioner of Srinagar, even that election, they were openly rigged. Openly. And the Election Commission did hardly anything about it. And I discussed this matter with Mr. Lindo many years later when he was Chief Election Commissioner. He said, well, you see, Kashmir has a special state. Now, this is what is resulting from Article 370. Therefore, the reaction of the people, and I said it was not just how the government had they taken the reaction of the people by simply cleaving to a legalistic point of view. That no, under the law, we are doing the right thing. I think that is where the harm is being done. What I am pleading for is that yes, when you are dealing with a law concerning the people, which concerns a particular group of people, then you must consult those people. Now, how you consult those people? The law has prescribed ways through their elected representatives. But when the elected representatives are not there, you find other ways to do it.
That's right. And I think that's a very practical perspective in terms of how that spirit of that article can be maintained. So I think we've got a different legal as well as a administrative perspective. And actually, historically, if I may say, that Article 35A, which we were talking about, actually was brought in, this permanent resident notification was brought in by the father of Karan Singh, Maharaja Hari Singh, at that point of time, as something which might be sought for the Muslim subjects, but actually the biggest beneficiary of this were the Kashmiri Pandits. So it was the demand of the Kashmiri Pandits that because a lot of the jobs were being taken up by Punjabi immigrants, and as Dr. Karan Singh recently told me, also by a lot of Bengalis who were in Kashmir, and I was surprised to hear that. But most of them were taken by people who were outsiders of the state, so it was a demand primarily by the Kashmiri Pandits. And of course, the Muslim representation as a result of that permanent resident notification was very, very meager. So Mridu, just one last question to you and to Jinali, and then we open up for questions for the audience. So the question is, I know you're a historian, but historians always not only have the key to the past, but also perhaps sometimes to the future. So what next? Where do you think that we go from here?
It's, given that we're discussing what this government has decided, I suppose we should focus on what it is that this government sought to achieve with the revocation of both 370 and 35A. I'm not sure that, that the Supreme Court will turn the clock back. I'm not sure that Article 370 is particularly relevant anyway. But I do believe, I mean, I hear Mr. Datar's point about, those who were kept outside, with no rights within the state because of Article 35A. But I think that it's important to also remember that you need, and here I agree with Mr. Habibullah, that, there has to be a political sort of context to legal sort of arrangements, and that's vitally different. I'd like to suggest that, in some ways, yes, it's easy to knock 35A, saying it didn't give rights to refugees who've been living in the state for over 70 years and so on and so forth. But then I'd like to argue that no government in Kashmir had been allowed the political space in which to even change some of the more sort of iniquitous aspects of 35A. What is happening today, though, with the abrogation of 35A is truly frightening. I mean, there's been a slew of laws that has, of course, raised the suspicion of many Kashmiris about, some use the term settler colonialism being the new project of of the government in Delhi. And that has to be stopped. Now, whether it's through revoking 35A or only through, in fact, halting the wholesale appropriation of land, new domicile laws that actually end up, sort of opening the way to taking over, wood forest areas, new cantonment laws. I mean, the slew of laws, the speed with which they've been funneled into Kashmir, that does need to stop. And I think that can only, receive any kind of halt if, as Mr. Habibullah suggested, the will of the people of Kashmir is consulted, and of Jammu. Not people in Jammu and in Ladakh are not particularly pleased with the revocation of 35A either. But it's time that the people of these regions be listened to, and that political space be provided. Let's hear from them where we go next.
Yeah, and one can hope that they will have not just the district council elections that have happened, but also a state government, as in that state sometime soon. But generally, we mentioned this, Mridu mentioned this point about the Supreme Court saying that we can turn the clock back. When the matter was raised a couple of times, as in the first time when this was challenged, and the second time when there were two union territories that were being formed administratively. So, in your view, is that a realistic possibility at this point of time?
I mean, I don't think so, to be honest. It doesn't seem like a realistic possibility given the fact that it's been so long, since the Supreme Court. I mean, it's not even heard the matter. It's been really long. Our book came out before the Supreme Court even heard the matter.
Yeah, actually, we thought that this would be an intervention petition in the Supreme Court when we started out. But then the matter was filed actually within 2 weeks, and we thought we were too late. Really, we were a bit early. You could still make it an intervention application. But I agree with you, and I think that it's hard to see how that's going to happen at this point in time. I know that there are many other things that I'd like to discuss, but we've got a great audience here, so we will now open it up to questions from the audience. And Keshav, we can figure out some way to do this on Zoom as well. And if there are people, we can ask them to type out their questions. And we can
just raise their hand and then I can have them.
Yeah, so we can, if there's anyone who wants to ask a question on Zoom, please do raise your hand and we'll try and come to you. But we have a question right here in front. There's a mic just next to you, and then we have one in the back there. Please.
So I'm K. Manish, I'm a civil servant, and my question is to Professor Mr. Habibullah. So you were the Deputy Commissioner of Srinagar, and you know the elections were rigged. So as the returning officer, did you send any report to the Election Commission of India that, look, this is my report, and we need to have a read as a returning officer? That's number one. And number two, what do you think is the symbol of India's sovereignty in Kashmir? Is it just the presence of the Indian army? Thank you.
So far as the 1977 election that was done, you see the point that you're making. Up to that time, the elections I took quite young returning officer. But in 1977, that I was Deputy Commissioner Srinagar, when I was returning officer in Srinagar. Up to that time, I'd been a polling officer or some such thing. Nobody had ever petitioned the Election Commission that the election was not fair. I've of course discussed this in detail in my book also, but in my election, 1977, I was in fact complimented by many people, and as you know, probably many people say that was the first election was completely free and fair. I, as Deputy Commissioner, was aware that in many cases it was not, because in what way the polling booths were seized by certain groups of gundas. There was nobody willing to come out and actually say that yes, this election, this happened in such and such place. I was in constant touch with the Election Commission and brought it to their notice. But it was not for me to make a written complaint. Their counting was quite fair, and it was done under the supervision of the returning officer. who was president of the council. But the filling of the what do you call them,
The ballot.
the reading of the ballot papers, I was told had occurred. But when anybody was asked to come and actually attest to that fact, they wouldn't. So this was how the things had been going on earlier. The facts that I mentioned it to you again, the Election Commission, and as I mentioned, this is in 2002, when I was actually on behalf of the government approaching the separatists also to actually come and participate in the election. And they, of course, came up with this plea that these elections are always rigged so for the purpose of our participating. So I've taken that matter to Mr. Lingdon and said, it should, and you know that the 2002 elections were in fact relatively fair. And the sitting government at that time, the Wajahat Habibullah government, was in fact supplanted with the Mufti Said government. So one was working through the system that way, but one could not bring up, your question was, did I make any formal complaints? No, no formal complaints were made at that time. What was the second question?
About the army.
Symbol of India, all of us. You IAS officers. But this also came later. We have a close relation of one of the first IAS officers, direct recruits, Arghya Sengupta, who was there. But that happened in 1962. He was in 1962 back. Before that, all the IAS officers, the IAS had been extended there earlier, but the IAS officers were promotees. Most of them were promoted. Then in 1962, the government of India started sending direct recruit IAS officers. But then over a period of time, that also had a cadre like any other cadre. There were direct recruits, promoted officers, and so on. Yes, but in consequence to Article 370, the proportion of promoted officers was a little higher than it was in other cases. You had planned funds. Again, the symbol of India's sovereignty, but in financial terms, but the percentage given for the amount that had to be reimbursed from the state was higher in J&K than it was in Delhi. But there's not only in J&K, there's several states which were given that concession, and J&K was among those states. So there were various means in which, of course, the Indian sovereignty was asserted well beyond, I mean, not only the military, the central central police force and so on, in many ways. But in consequence of Article 370, it was somewhat limited. It was a little more limited than it is. That is the only thing.
So in the interest of time, we'll take a few questions together. There was one at the back there in the check shirt. Yeah, if you could get one. I had promised Mr. Datar that we'd allow him to leave because he had a function. So if there are any ones for him, then I'll take those first. I'll take one there. Yeah.
Hello, sir. I have a question for Mr. Habibullah. Sir, what are your thoughts on separatist report for Jammu? Because I have some friends from the region whose stance is that Jammu has always been shortchanged. The Kashmiris have both Abdullah family the state and the Gandhi Nehru family and the Pandits have been in Delhi. They have always been buried and burdened with Kashmir's complexity, while they have always had a unique culture, cuisine, language different from Kashmir.
Mr. Habibullah, we'll just take a few together. This question is on separatism in Jammu and treating it separately from Kashmir. There's a question here, the lady in green.
Good evening to the panel. So I have two questions. The first one is something that goes off from what Mr. Datar observed, that Article 370 over the years has pretty much been hollowed out, and it was only a matter of time before it struck off the statute book. My question is that what, according to the panel, took so long? Was it merely political will that was lacking, or is there more to it that it happened all these years later? And my second question is again also coming from what Mr. Datar observed, a question that he has posed, which the panel can take as it deems fit, is that how do we argue for the sustenance of Article 35A while supporting the abrogation of Article 370, because they seem the idea seems to be diametrically opposed. So if the panel could just take these questions. Thank you.
Right. We'll take one question from Zoom. I think there are several questions on Zoom. So Keshav, you could read out a question from Zoom.
So this is a question to Mr. Datar from Divya Bhatnagar. Her question is the Supreme Court trying to comprehend the political context or political ramifications of Parliament's pruning of Article 370?
Oh, and I think I can just see Justice Sri Krishna has a point here on the Zoom chat. So if you could just please read that out.
Yeah. So the point is the doctrine of inability to turn the clock. Does it not run against the concept of rule of law and allowing things to be done by lapse of time?
So Mr. Datar, if you could take these questions together, Justice Sri
Yes.
Krishna asked about the inability to turn the clock back. Then there's a question about how we can keep 35A and 370, do they not pull in different directions? If you, and the other one that was asked, if you could.
Yes, yes. I'm sorry, Arghya, because I had to leave for some function.
You had told me, so that's why I thought I'll get the questions.
No,
to
so
you.
see, I tell you, there is a real danger because this is one problem. Suppose there's a considerable delay between the filing of the petition and the ultimate disposal, then it does become difficult, if not impossible, to set the clock back. And you can perhaps do it technically, but how far it can be done practically is a question. And this is going to come again and again, not only in the context of 370, but other sensitive issues as well. So this rolling back will become more and more difficult as the years go by. If at all.
I was just seeing, sorry to interrupt you for a second, but I was just seeing that the constitutionality of the breakup of Andhra Pradesh into Telangana and Andhra Pradesh is still pending in the Supreme Court for 11 years. And I don't think that even anybody who can say that we turn the clock back in Jammu and Kashmir can say that we are now going to turn the clock back in Telangana and Andhra Pradesh.
Yes, but only one thing is, as far as this Jammu Kashmir issue is concerned, as a student of constitutional law, I don't think the challenge is really substantial in the light of a series of Supreme Court judgments. What has happened? It's not something so drastically wrong that it is likely to be set aside. I mean, I know there are strong viewpoints on both sides, but if you see the line of judgment from 1959 to 2019, generally what the Parliament has done may not be open to challenge, may not be struck down, is my personal opinion. So this rollback theory is more of a theoretical point which I'm thinking of right now. And as far as 35 is concerned, yes, I couldn't hear the lady properly, but I do feel that 35A, one of the benefits of deleting 370 is that 35 also goes. That's the point. And I still am. We have to really make a serious study of how far you can have this kind of a special status and 35A when you've got the basic structure saying right to equality is part of the basic structure and so on. Once all of you are citizens of India, how do you then make a discrimination in terms of 370? Can you have a special status? I know there are cases of Nagaland, Andhra Pradesh, 371 articles, series of articles are there. But this was 35 was a completely different plane. There's no similar provision anywhere in the constitution like 35A.
Thank you very much, Mr. Datar. And I know you had told me earlier that you would like to go at 8 o'clock. We've already kept you for 10 minutes beyond that. So if you'd like to stay, more than welcome. We'll finish in 5 minutes. But
I'll just stay for a minute.
We'll finish this in the next 5 minutes. Mr. Habibullah, the question on Jammu and the disaffection in Jammu.
When you see the state, now this is a much wider question. The three regions of the state. The whole of Jammu and Kashmir, the province, and Dr. Karan Singh never tired of mentioning this. It was not a cohesive entity. It was property discussed. It was sale of property. It was treated as property. It was a large property, very diverse, with different peoples. Even I mentioned to you the Muslims of Great simply saying the Muslim majority, but even among the Muslims, there are different types. For example, you have a large Shia community in Kargil, which is of Tibetan origin and Central Asian origin, very different to the Kashmiri, and so on. The state is extremely diverse, and it is also very diverse in its political aspiration. This movement for secession was in fact much stronger in the Jammu sector. And when you talk of Jammu, please remember they're talking of the whole area from Kachwa to Poonch Rajouri. And it has a large section which is called Trans Chenab, which has a large Muslim majority. But their thinking also has not been the same as that of the Valley. Now the irony is that in 1947, 1948, when the war took place, the areas which were in Punch, Rajouri, and that area were highly pro-Pakistan. And Kashmir, both Hindu and both Pandit and Muslim, was very much in favor, which is why the state actually acceded to India, because it was led by Sheikh Abdullah, who was the pillar of Indian support inside the valley, and also the most popular leader.
That's why, as you
That is our report in our case.
that's why, as you rightly said, that the Muslims of Jammu, as one, they were more interested in going to Pakistan, and large part did go to what is now in Pakistan occupied Kashmir, and also the massacre of Muslims in Jammu didn't lead to much of a protest from Sheikh
This is
Abdullah.
not completely reversed.
And it has completely reversed, and it's a irony of time. We are out of time, but we take one last set of questions. We've got one hand at the back, one hand here, and one there. We'll try, please make it as quick as possible, because we do want to wrap this up. Yeah, at the back.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you for this presentation. It's very interesting. I wanted to know from a constitutional lawyer sitting on the screen what he thinks about the fact that yes, 370 is gone, probably for good. I don't think the Supreme Court will unravel that. But the electoral process having gone for so long, and leaders also having been put behind, house arrest, etc., for such a long period of time, do you not think that's the constitutional process gone into decay and absolute pause for so long without people having the opportunity to vote in their state, whether it's Jammu or Kashmir or anything new that was carved out? Thank you.
Right, so we in front here. One in front and one at the back. So if we get one mic up here, we'll quickly take yours as well. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Arvind. I am a doctoral student at Nalsar. So I'm working on constitutional history of Kashmir. My question is to Mr. Datar. When he says that Article 370 or 35A, they could not qualify in today's times, they could not qualify to be a part of the basic structure of the constitution. I mean, how is it possible for a constitutional court to ignore questions of great political and historical importance? Because when you look at the debates on Article 370 in the Constituent Assembly of India, you have the major answers that were put in defense of 370 were these, that the state is still divided. I mean, the part of the state is still under the administration of Pakistan. Second, that the will of the people has to be solved. So these are questions that are still there. I mean, how can a constitutional court ignore such?
How can the basic structure doctrine ignore real historical and political development? Fine. Take one here and then the last one.
My name is Sudeep Srivastava. I'm an advocate. My question is very simple to the entire panel. Whether bringing 370 and 35A was the need of the hour at that point of time. And if that was need of the hour, then why the regime and especially Prime Minister of that time is being condemned so badly nowadays for bringing 370 and 35A?
Thank you. Last question here.
My question is to Datar sir, as an expert on Indian federalism. So he said that it was totally all right the way in which the 370 was repealed from the constitution. But how much right it was even deny the statehood to JNK? Was it totally a state choice because of hostile neighbor or something else?
That's right. So, Mr. Datar, so why don't you take those? The first one from Hamin about the decay of what has happened after, and that's related to this question about statehood, and the separate one on basic structure, how can it remain blind to legal and political development? And then
there are two separate issues. One is the manner in which 370 has been amended or substituted technically, and whether that was right or wrong. And secondly, what's happened post 2019. Well, there are serious concerns that elections have not been held, people have been held without trial. These are definitely matters which are regrettable and which are serious. And I wish the courts had taken up these petitions, habeas corpus, etc., more quickly. But that's an unfortunate part of the whole thing. On the question of basic structure and will of the people and so on, I say this will of the people is a very, very nebulous kind of a concept. You mentioned about the debates in the Constituent Assembly. Of course, I remember I was reading, I think the speech of Sardar Patel is really moving. But the point is now, when 370 was done, first of all, we forget it was a temporary provision. It was supposed to be only for a short period of time. But unfortunately, the temporary became permanent. I don't want to go into how the plebiscite was there and how Jinnah and Liaquat Ali themselves backed out of the plebiscite proposal. All those things have gone. And ultimately, I think that once the Constituent Assembly of Jammu and Kashmir decided to become part of India, if that was the will of the people that was represented by becoming part of India, then sooner or later 370 had to go. You couldn't keep having a special status while becoming part of India forever and ever.
So generally, we take the question on 370 and 35A being the need of the hour. So why condemn those who did it at that time today?
So I probably answered the first part of your question. I don't think I can answer the second part of the question. But I think like looking at the history of 370, I mean, I would agree with you. It was the need of the hour at that point of time. And the reason, and Iyengar says it actually in the Constituent Assembly, there are multiple reasons. He says, there is a war with Pakistan, there's a dispute at the United Nations, and some parts of the state are also occupied by Pakistan. And of course, Mountbatten's, promise to Maharaja Hari Singh is that the will of the people will be taken into consideration. And because all of this is in a flux and it's not been decided, they come up with this arrangement, which is 370, which is a temporary arrangement. And they say that what Iyengar says actually, interestingly, is that Kashmir today is not ripe for integration, in 1950, and which is why 370 is needed. It is the need of the hour because it's not like the other princely states. But he hopes that in due course of time, Kashmir will become ripe for integration. Those are his words. So 370 at that point of time was the need of the hour because Kashmir was different. And there were all of these other factors around Kashmir. But the way it was drafted, we can debate it, etc. But the provision itself, I agree with you, it was the need of the hour. So I'm answering the first part.
So Mridu, if you could take that second part, maybe not in this context, but also more generally, because we tend to sometimes condemn historical figures for actions that they took in that context, which seem anachronistic today, but may not have been the case when they took that action. What's your sense on that?
Okay, I'm going to try and answer it from the perspective of Kashmir. God forbid that I should speak on behalf of Kashmiris. That's not my attempt at all. One figure who is, of course, very reviled today in Kashmir in the valley is Sheikh Abdullah himself. And I think in some ways, perhaps he's gotten a bad rap because I agree with Janali that he too is dealing with very specific circumstances in 1949 and so on and so forth. What is, I think, very difficult to defend is that despite the promises made by Jawaharlal Nehru, forget about Mountbatten, but it's seen as a firm promise made by the government of India to hold a plebiscite. Just the dropping of that promise, with no mention of it, just allowing it to quietly just be shoved under a carpet, has sort of, laid Nehru open to condemnation amongst large numbers of Kashmiris. And it's as simple as that point, that this was a solemn promise that as Kashmiris, large numbers of them see it, that they had a right to self-determination. So 370 was not temporary in that sense. It was conditional. It wasn't seen as temporary. It was seen clearly as conditional. So I think, Nehru comes under flack for that, and Sheikh Abdullah is given flack for having allowed, in some ways, perhaps especially for having made his pact with the quote-unquote devil in 1975.
Yeah, that's right. Mr. Habibullah, last word to you. Our book is titled Hamīñ Ast. So, Garfirdos, Barruez, Hamīñ Ast, Hamīñ Ast, Hamīñ Ast, Hamīñ Ast. Will that ever be true again?
Well, on that, I would like to give you another quotation from Sheikh Abdullah when he acceded, and it's in the large shop. Muntu Shudam to Mun Shudu Shudi, Muntun Shudam to Jan Suniti, that is, I have become you and you me. I the body, you the soul. This was what Sheikh Abdullah said. Oh, and this is a need for sure. The other quote is not a need for sure, but this is. No, the point that what Mridu is pointing out, I don't know, you say it was entirely necessary. Article 370 became necessary. Article 370, yes, became necessary because a large portion of the state was under occupation and because the matter had gone to the UN. But why otherwise did state require any special status? It was a state which acceded to India and therefore should have been treated like any other state. But the fact is, as I mentioned to you, the movement within the state initially was to get rid of the monarchy, and it had also been discussed as to how that resentment went on for years. So on the one hand, you had the state being which had not been part of the anti-colonial, but a state which had been contesting the rule of the Maharaja, and you are now being asked that the rule of the Maharaja will continue, which also gave birth to Article 370. So, had it been in the normal course, this is part of history, it did not happen. And I mentioned to you what happened in Northwest Frontier province also. In the case of Pakistan, they had their own leader, wanted the state should be independent. And here too, the preference of Sheikh Abdullah was independent, but he felt it was impractical. It could not be achieved. And this is what he said. So for that reason, you had Article 370. But this is something that you would have to argue. But the point now is that the situation now has to be seen in present circumstances. And the present circumstances, Article 370 really has no meaning. And I go back to my own point that had it been normalized, not necessarily nullified, you can say normalized, to the normal course with consultation with people, you may not have had to face the situation that you're facing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Habibullah. I hope that our rich discussion today, first of all, thank you very much to Mr. Habibullah, Mridu, and Mr. Datar and Vidhi. This has been a really fascinating and diverse discussion on various subject matters relating to Article 370 and the history of Jammu and Kashmir. So thank you very much. I hope that this discussion excites you not only to read our book on the biography of Article 370, but Mr. Habibullah's book on Jammu and Kashmir and Mridu's book on Hindu rulers, Muslim subjects. I think there needs to be a lot more writing about Jammu and Kashmir so that people can have an informed point of view. But thank you very much to everyone who's here today for spending their Friday evening with us on the subject. For everyone who's joined on Zoom, thank you very much. I know there were many further questions, but I'm sorry that we couldn't take any more because of a paucity of time. But I do urge all of you to read our book and read the other books that have been written by the panelists. And I'm sure that you will enjoy reading them. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.